What is an odd front? An odd front consists of three primary down linemen at the rudimentary level. That number can expand to five in most base 3-4s. At a deeper level, odd spacing is when a defense eliminates the B gap bubble found naturally in even fronts. And this is where it gets confusing. A defense can have an odd front, but live in even spacing. The most common example of this is an underfront in a 3-4. Even fronts can live in odd spacing by using reductions or post-snap movements that close the natural B-gap bubbles in its structure. This type of defense has become very popular at the college level. The most popular odd front in football is the Tite front, which places two defensive linemen in the B gaps in what is referred to as four eyes, meaning they are on the inside shade of the guard. Odd fronts are prevalent at all levels because they require fewer down linemen and can easily transition into multiple structures, and it's really easy to blitz out of. In this clinic, we will look at some of the more popular front structures in the odd front universe and discuss their uses. Before we go any further, let's break down even and odd spacing, because I think this is where the confusion starts, is that people think and assume that because you have an even front to start, that you then live in even spacing. So spacing is a term, and it's a coach speak term that is used to tell what kind of run fits you're getting and what kind of formation structure you're going to have with your defense. These things matter when you go up against offenses and how you then fit the run. So here is an even front. This is an over front. We have an open B gap bubble that a will linebacker has to take. So we don't consider the A gap necessarily an open bubble because it's inside the box. There's a lot going on. Most offenses aren't trying to really hit the A gap unless they're trying to run A gap power, which there's very few teams that are still trying to do that. Mostly everything is going to hit off tackle. The reason why the B gap bubble is so important is because this is the conflict area for the defense. So if we have a 2x2 set, four open set, meaning there's four wide receivers that are not attached to the box, that will linebacker has to climb out. So how do we fit that right there? A lot of people just fold them in. You do have some heavy technique things that you can fit in that's kind of quasi even, odd spacing, even front, but odd spacing. But the easiest way to do that is by just getting into an odd spacing or an odd front, right? And so this is where you get the confusion. This is an odd front. There's three down linemen. The jack is kind of technically your fourth kind of quasi. This is a nickel looking set. You can have a base 3-4 where you have five down linemen, but these guys have to cover down. And so that's where this comes in. This is odd spacing because we have two defensive linemen that are in the B gaps. There is no B gap bubble. So the conflict is placed in the C gap area, which is easier to handle. Yes, I know it's confusing. If this is the first time you're seeing it, there's probably things spinning around. There's probably math problems going on in your head. I understand. This, I'm going to make it as simple as possible. An even front means that there's four down linemen. Okay, that's what we have here. An odd front means that there's three primary down linemen. There can be up to five depending on what it is. Interestingly, 3-4 nickels have four technically linemen, but this jackbacker is a hybrid. Now, you can have that in the even front, but typically for this purpose, we're just going to have even front. Even spacing, open B gap bubble, odd spacing, there is no open B gap bubble. The conflict is in the C areas. That's the easiest way to remember this. Now, what we're going to get into is the different iterations of odd fronts and what the popular ones are, and then what are some kind of counters that are inside that universe. In our first one, this is where pretty much everybody starts. This is going to be a 404. A lot of odd front coaches like this because if they're movement based, they can send these guys left to right and they can create different front structures out of this. At the end of the day, these guys are technically in the B gap, and we have our outside linebackers who are going to live in that C area. Inside, we're going to fit A to C, which means if we get a tight end, he's going to fit the D gap, he'll fit C gap, he'll fit A gap, just depending on how things flow, especially if we have the back this way. If he works across, he would be D. He falls back to C. He takes A gap. So that's normally the fit structure that you get within these. So the tough front is this starting point. We always start head up. The next one off of this is, what if we have a tight end? It just looks the exact same. So what if he's off ball? What if he's on ball? It doesn't really change, except for we're going to get at what's called a heavy 5. So the tough front is going to turn into a heavy 5 because we want to put a presence here, but he's going to end up in this B gap. So that's why it's called a heavy 5, is that he's going to work to the face of the tackle, and then he's going to work into the B gap. If there's some sort of zone action this way, he would just make sure that he cuts it off, gets in front, and then he closes that B gap off. So the tough front, if we have our slicing action, our Y off, which is the typical way that most people align now, then what if we have on ball? He's just going to expand into a 5, which is going to be outside shade of that tackle, but it's a heavy, heavy 5. I mean, he's basically like on the outside eye of that tackle. He's going to end up in that B gap. Now, this is the most popular front probably in football. You probably heard Tite. You probably heard mint. What does that mean? Well, mint is just a Saban vernacular for their tight front kind of world that they live in their nickel package. The tight front, though, is just telling you that we are going to take those 4s and make them 4 eyes. We're keeping the 0. We've got that 4. Now we've got a 4 eye. Nothing really structurally changes. So if you look at it, we have our tough 404. We have a heavy 5. He just expands because we have a tight end on the line. Tight front, we're just going to make sure that this guy gets into a 4 eye. Now you could say, what happens if the tight end gets on the line? This guy can expand into a 4. You pretty much expand to kind of a half man because you don't want to expose that B gap. So again, we have tough, then you get tight, then you get into bear front. So a bear front, what does that mean? That means we're going to get really tight. We're going to tighten down even more. We're going to put these guys in 3. So they're basically going to be on that outside shade of the guard. The nose is going to be head up again, and then another outside shade of the guard. Nothing really changes. We're still A to C fits here. It's just a 303. So the biggest difference is that little movement inside. We're just compressing things down. A lot of times teams like this, just because if you have a tight end, you can drop this guy right on top. It just kind of compresses everything down into it. This is more expansive. That you can kind of knock back some of these linemen. You kind of have more control of that big gap. You're asking that guard to come get you. Now you kind of unleash that tackle. Now you're really putting a presence in there. You're really forcing these 3 to really be head up on these 3. So this is a bear front. From this, you get the Okie front. So if you've ever heard me talk, I call Okie an under front. It's one of those terms. Most odd front teams, when you say Okie, that means it's going to be a 505. And again, these guys are playing heavy, which means that they are going to kind of, some will call it a splatter or a fist, because you're going to knock through and you're going to get into that B gap, or you're going to splatter off that tackle and you're going to get into the B gap, however you want to use it. You're going to get a heavy technique. These guys are going to end up. So we still have our odd front. We're going to have our 505. This is really popular anytime a tight end is introduced in 3 high schemes. So a lot of 3 high schemes will get into a 505 because they can have a solid edge and they can really pinch that down. If you're going to play a lot of spill and kill from an odd stack, you get into a 505. Again, tough front is really popular with movement base. This would be that East Coast 3-4. This is like your App State guys. Tight front is more of your Aranda, Saban universe that everybody likes. And then bear front is kind of that old school bear 46, that adjustment. Everything's really tight. We're just trying to kind of pinch everything down. And then you have Okie, which is 505, which is we want wide and we're just going to spill everything outside. So we want to splatter. We want to knock through. We want to be heavy through everything out there. Again, that's really popular in these 3 high schemes. Then we get into our eagle reductions, right? So we have strong eagle. All this means is we're moving the nose into a shade, and then we're moving to a 3. So we've got kind of a 4 eye, we've got a shade, we've got a 3. This is a good example of what this looks like actually in practice, is that we have a slide. Now we don't have our jack, so we are in a nickel package, but you can see how if the Sam linebacker were to have to move out, what this would look like. So you would have kind of your 4 eye to the tight end, you have a shade, you have your 4 eye or a 3, and then you have a guy outside of it. Now you can play games away on this 3 side. So you can have him kind of overlap, and you can do a bunch of different things otherwise, but this is our strong eagle. From that, we now get weak eagle, which is essentially what you're just moving away from the tight end. So now you have a 3 technique. Now you kind of have that 6 who's going to work into make sure that he takes the C gap. You have a shade. You can expand this to a 4-eye, and then you can have your outside guy. So it's just really, where do you want that nose? Do you want him to the tight end? Maybe it's just for angles on counter, right? Maybe you want to have him away from this so that you really are locking down this cutback on this split zone and forcing him to go front side. So it's just really what you want out of that. So we have a strong eagle, we have a weak eagle, and then here's just really some kind of these reductions even within the tight front. This is a big thing in the Aranda universe. If we have a tight end, and where's the back going to be? So if we have a tight end and we have it stacked, we're going to get into what's called an eagle, right? So we're just going to move the nose and we're going to move it into a 4-eye. So we're just moving the nose and we're moving to a 3 technique. We're just getting into an eagle reduction. We're just moving here. So here's our tight end. Here's our running back. They're stacked. We're now in a shade. We're now in a 3. We're pulling that line with us. Now, if the back is weak, we want to get into an underfront. And so there, now we're going to pull that. You can even run a Cinco. That's another thing just that tells them, hey, you have a heavy 5. So we're going to get a heavy 5 technique. He's in a shade. He's in a 4-eye to 3. So now we're in an underfront reduction. And the reason why you do this really is anytime that you get these 2 guys stacked, you're looking at plays like duo. You're looking at plays like any kind of down zone, these downhill runs. You can get counter going back. And what this does is it changes the leverage. So leverage is really important. So if you are not a believer in defensive formations and you're sitting here and you're saying, no, it's just really just you kind of go tackle the ball carrier, that's false. Angles matter and leverage matters in these front structures. And when you're an odd front, you can really dictate a lot of these structures, which is why in the tight universe, you are going to have an eagle right or a slide check. And that's where these come into, or a Cinco check, which gets you into a heavy 5 and you're really playing an underfront. So these are really important in terms of how you build this. Why would you run an underfront? You want to have a solid 5 on either side. Now, if we're getting any kind of zone action, we can really rock through this. If we're getting stretched, we have a nice wall build. There's different ways that you can do this, and now you're structuring this outside. So even within this, you have this 4-0-4 look, but there's a lot of reductions and movements and then shifts that you have within it to really leverage these plays. So hopefully you can see kind of that evolution from the Tuff to the Tite to Okie. Then we have our eagle fronts within the 5-man universe. And then we have this nickel. And then now how are we doing it when we have a nickel and he's not necessarily a Sam linebacker? Because if you look at this, this is your base 3-4. So you'll start noticing in your base 3-4, a lot of teams will start in Tuff. Then from that, you'll get your eagle reductions, whether they're strong, so you're just moving the nose to the strong side, or you're getting it weak, which you're moving the guy to the weak side. And that's what I put in these images is essentially here, this is a 5-1 front. The penny package, the sub package within the NFL is getting really popular. Why? Is because we can play these 5-man fronts. We can now do this and bring a nickel inside. We still have a 5-man presence on the line. Here, if you're playing nickel, you have this really soft C area because your nickel is out wide. Your Mike is probably going to have to get into the C area. How can we maintain some help here? And that's normally where you're going to see this, is that they're going to get into these slide fronts where we're going to go eagle, or if it's 4 strong, we're going to go slide. If it's away, we can go Cinco to get it into an underfront, or have an under check to get into that solid 5 technique. So these are going to be your odd fronts in this odd front universe. There's so many different flavors within the odd front. It really illustrates its uniqueness within the sport of being able to do a lot of things. You can be in an odd front and even play even spacing. You can be an even front, and then you're kind of stuck within an over under, or how do we get into odd fronts? We have to play these reductions. So a lot of people, especially at the lower levels, with a lot of tweeners, with a lot of hybrid guys, love the odd front and what it gives them, because they can blitz from different areas. They can give a bunch of different looks. They can structure it in a way to really counter what the play is coming. Now, a lot of times people are going to start in that tough or that tight because we're going to eliminate those B gaps, or we're going to use movement to dictate where those things are going to go. And so again, what is an odd front? It's a mixed bag of things, but at the end of the day, it's having 3 or 5 defensive linemen on the field if you're just playing the numbers game. But it means much more than that. There's a bunch of different structures within that universe, and it also comes down to what kind of spacing that you're playing in as well. So hopefully you learned a little bit more about what is an underfront.